As many of you know, today's conversation is going to sit at the intersection of innovation and accountability. So our goal today is really to have climate ambition meet the rule of law. And as the biochar and carbon removal sectors mature, developers, landowners, investors, and many others are realizing that legal structure and compliance aren't just guardrails. They're the scaffolding of trust that will ultimately determine which projects endure and scale. And I can tell you, having traveled the country straight out the last few months, this is a red hot topic on the minds of many, both at the same. If you look at contracts and permitting, and then you tie it into carbon credit integrity and financing, the goal here is going to be, how do we unpack the legal DNA of credible, investable carbon projects? And a saying that I remember a ways back is, sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. So our goal here is going to be transparency. And Peter's going to talk a lot about contracts, for regulatory clarity, and what is going to make our market thrive. And just one more lead in, and then we're going to kick off the conversation. When I think about this conversation, it's really, the life of law has not been logic. It's been experience. That was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. And it's a reminder through lived outcomes, not abstract theory. So in carbon removal, and particularly biochar, regulation is going to be shaped by real world projects that are going to prove what's credible, bankable, and socially responsible. So you've got standards for MRV, permanence, and liability. These things are going to mature through experience, and compliance will increasingly reward transparency and measurable impact. So the future legal framework for biochar will be written not by policymakers alone, but by the practitioners building it today. And there is nobody better to explore this with me than my good friend, Peter Meyer. I'm very fortunate being based in New York City, where Peter also is, to get to spend some time sitting down and pontificating about where markets are going. Peter is a transatlantic legal expert. He's got over 2 decades of experience guiding investors and climate tech developers across New York and Berlin in particular, but many parts of the country and the world. And he sits squarely at the intersection of law and innovation, with a goal of helping to shape the frameworks that make carbon removal both investable and compliant, with deep expertise in offtake agreements. So without further ado, we're going to dive in and examine how we can build the legal and institutional confidence needed for biochar and carbon removal to realize their full potential. So Peter, thank you for being with me. I let you take the floor to introduce yourself a little bit more and share a bit about your background and what you're seeing today in the legal world as it relates to biochar and carbon removals.
Jason, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I'm also really excited to see that so many people have signed up for this webinar, which shows that it is really sort of a hot topic, and that people are interested in legal aspects related to CDR, carbon removal, to biochar projects in particular. This also shows, I think, that the market is increasingly maturing. So, you know, when you're asking me what I'm seeing in the market, when my first contact that I had with a CDR project was about 3 years ago. And it really felt a bit immature at the time, the way things were being done on a contract side, on aspects of legal consideration. It was all just, yeah, we pull it somehow together and we're going to make it work. And I think that has matured tremendously, right? Sort of in my previous life as a lawyer, I would say, before I started working mainly with climate tech startups, was working with big infrastructure funds and utilities. So I had a background in building coal-fired power plants. Those are sort of very mature projects, obviously highly sophisticated, very complex. Then I had to redeem myself and go into CDR. But it's a very helpful experience, right? Because what we're basically doing is, if you're having a biochar facility in South Dakota or Indiana, It is basically like a small, you could say it's like a small power plant in a way. It's a miniature one. But the questions, conceptually, the questions are the same, right? How do I get permitting for it? What kind of contracts do I need? Supply contracts, right? Biomass for a coal-fired power plant, you need coal, right? Where you get your coal from. It's the questions are the same, and there are lessons that we can learn from previous projects that are already out there and that are working and that are functioning. And we need to obviously keep in mind that CDR has some very specific peculiarities that cannot be easily translated into other sectors. So if we talk about one thing maybe that we could talk about very briefly is, because it is something that always comes up, at least in my practice, is always the question around bankability of a project. And there is, I think, a tremendous misconception out in the market as to what that actually is. It's being sort of thrown around, and everyone, understands something differently. A typical project finance transaction is where you have a project that generates, certain outcome, a certain income that guarantees sort of the repayment of the loan, right? If you have a coal-fired power plant, you know exactly how much electricity it's going to produce. You know exactly how to sell it. There's some price volatility, but by and large, you can sort of, know how much money you're going to make. It's relatively easy to go with that understanding to a bank and have a proposal about, or to an infrastructure fund and have a proposal ready as to how this is going to be financed. With a CDR project, the whole thing is slightly different, right? Biochar may be somewhat different in that it is more advanced on the technology side than other, at least engineered, durable CDR solutions. But we are still sort of in the technology testing phase in many ways, right? And so an offtake agreement is more like a seal of confidence, I would say, by the offtaker in this particular kind of technology. Do we need the carbon credits that are being generated? That's a whole different question, right? As a revenue stream, who's going to buy it? At this stage in the market, all credits are basically 90% of the credits are basically purchased by Microsoft. That's not really a market. So the market needs to evolve. So when someone, when let's say a biochar producer or project developer talks about bankability of his or her project, and then goes to a bank and talks about project finance, there's a mismatch, right? The bank sort of thinks, okay, project finance. The project developer thinks, I basically just need a loan to buy some machinery, right? I need to finance my project. And there's a certain level of miscommunication. But that's, I think, that's just the stage where we're at, and things will evolve from that. And
as I'm hearing you talk, lots of industries kind of get born into this environment of chaos. Then they start to mature through structure, and then ultimately thrive on trust. And by the way, I have no idea where that came from. I heard it at some point, and it was funny because it was tied to the early days of when I was doing energy as a service, financing projects for microgrids. And to your point, bankability was always the confidence that a project would deliver reliable performance, revenue, and repayment ultimately. But you would thrive on those underlying long-term offtake agreements. That was kind of, and also the seal of confidence you reference, and we don't talk about this enough in the space, is also the team, the operating team. Absolutely. Because a lot of times in the biochar space, the projects we've seen that have had the most success, either these are pre-existing businesses, and or it's individuals that have come from another space. To your point, you and I both came from other, let's say, tangential spaces, and we're here, and there's lots of commonalities. But you hit on a really important thematic out of the gate, and that actually drives perfectly into a key question. As I was perusing the guest list of people here right now, and I know this is a red hot topic. And in question is really for the developers and landowners on this call, under the whole theme of the seal of confidence. Can you talk a little bit more about reduction of liabilities and contracting? What are some of the things that I know you have deep expertise and experience, particularly around offtake contracts, which is a thing that comes up in every dialogue we have, certainly with all different investors in the capital stack. Can you talk a little bit more about those things and what we need to do to push the odds in the favors of these developers and landowners that want to do projects?
Absolutely. And Jason, 100% team is also super important, right? As with any new project, any investor would always look, so who am I dealing with, right? So team, it's very,
AYC.
it's very important, no doubt. Sure. So on the contract side, right? So let's maybe start sort of with supply and sort of land usage agreements, and then we'll talk a little bit more about sort of offtakes, right? So if you have a biochar project, if you do it on the land you own, you're basically covered to a huge extent. You may have to think about supply lines, getting the biomass on your property, depending on what's the accessibility of the land. Those are questions you might want to have. But the challenge becomes more sort of when you lease it, right? Because then you may have overlapping interests. So it's very important in your lease agreement to make very clear that you are allowed to have a pyrolysis equipment on the land, and particularly that you are entitled to the credits that are to the carbon credits that are being generated by your activities. You don't want the landowner coming, oh, that's interesting, but that's, I want to have a share in that. So one can see that there could be sort of an overlapping interest. And the way just to avoid that is to make it explicitly clear in the lease agreement who is entitled to what. That's key. And contracts are really super important and super helpful in this context. It avoids you can avoid a tremendous amount of discussions later on by making these things clear, right? And for a supply contract, what's important, I would say, it's really important is the quality of your feedstock, right? So the permit you're getting depends on certain parameters with respect to the biomass that you're using there. So you got to make sure that in order to operate within those parameters, what you're getting from the supplier meets those conditions. So those are maybe the two, there are obviously other considerations, but those are sort of the two most important ones, I think, that stand out.
And Peter, tied to that too, just sticking on this topic, one theme we continue to see is this co-location. So you have again, let's call it a timber mill or a lumber mill, and they're co-locating, and there's an agreement that's being struck. Any best practices from a contracting perspective? You talked a lot about who controls the land, who gets access to the credits. But have you seen best practices tied to, hey, all right, there's company A that's going to develop biochar, company B that has the high quality feedstock, they've got the land, they maybe have a pre-existing business. Guidance on that to avoid disputes and ensure both parties share in the project's environment and financial benefits, because that is an intriguing one that I continue to see over and over again.
Yes. So, I mean, you could, one way of addressing that is by entering into a joint venture agreement or even setting up a joint venture company that um, um, deals with both of those aspects, right? So what's key is really to define and specify the individual rights and obligations as clearly as possible. To have, in the event that there is some kind of a dispute as to who owns what and who is entitled to what, or who needs to do what kind, you know, who has what kind of liability or obligation, a good mediation clause might also help in those agreements. If there is some kind of dispute with respect to feedstock quality, to have a third party designated from the beginning that is qualified to make that call, binding for both parties. So there are various kinds of issues one can think about. The key is really to be as clear as possible. And I think with this co-ownership situation, I think a joint venture is probably the best, you know, or very often can be a good solution.
No, that's clear. Just for the group, when Peter's talking about offtake, there's two elements, and we'll go deeper into that. But there's the offtake of the carbon credits, and then offtake of the physical end product, and that's obviously where we are at Grain, spending the bulk of our time today. Some of the big markets we see: agriculture, industry, fuels, filtration, aggregates, etc. If you were at the U.S. Biochar conference last 2 months ago now, hard to believe it's November, there was a very large contingent of companies there intrigued by the biochar value proposition as an aggregate or a filtration source, or for Superfund sites, or for replacement in steel coke. So there was a question that came in. I just wanted to be very clear about what we mean when we talk a little bit about offtake, and you're going to hear Peter use different terms throughout this dialogue. And speaking of those terms, obviously all of those things are going to be tied to creating well-structured agreements that are essential to drive these things forward and ensure that there's no doubt around ownership structure. And that's what you just alluded to, because contracting liability center on ensuring clear rights and protections between all the stakeholders, particularly when it comes to contracts for the actual feedstock, and then, of course, for the offtakes, which are mission critical. Now, Peter, this funnels into a red hot topic, the carbon credit markets. Obviously, you've already started to give your perspective a little bit on that as it relates to voluntary and compliance. But let's talk about legal risks, because obviously my phone exploded a little over a year ago when we saw all this stuff related to forestry, carbon credits, and moral hazard and issues. Obviously, a lot of those projects were in Africa, and indigenous communities not actually getting the right outputs that they were entitled to. So can you talk about some of the legal risks around additionality and double counting, and what that means for the voluntary and compliance markets, and maybe tie into a little bit around MRV? I think that's everybody would appreciate hearing more about that.
Absolutely. I mean, carbon credits can be an important source of income for project developers, right? Tapping into the voluntary carbon market, being able to sell carbon credits is very important. And for many CDR companies, it's basically the only source of revenue that they have potentially. Biochar is a great product in itself, so there may be other applications down the road. But the voluntary carbon market is for CDR companies really extremely important, and integrity is the crux of the whole thing. There's been a lot of bad press about credits that were basically worthless, that overstated the amount of carbon dioxide that has actually been removed. That makes it difficult for new buyers to get into this market, because they think, well, okay, we are emitting carbon, that is a risk, but buying carbon dioxide removal credits, aren't we just adding to that risk by buying something that could potentially hurt us from a reputational standpoint. So these are things that's sort of the big picture the BCM sort of operates in, right? And we have these solutions to address these issues. We know there are MRV protocols out there that address these issues. We have the capacity to measure carbon, to sequester it, and to address all these concerns of potential buyers. And an offtake agreement obviously plays a very important role in that. It's a risk mitigation tool. It's like basically any contract is a risk mitigation tool. And conversations that I've had with first-time buyers or potential first-time buyers, they always say, one thing that always comes up is the contract. The lack of standardization of offtake agreements. Everyone's using something else that leads to a tremendous amount of confusion. So standardization, I think, is something that's going to be really, really important. And then I think the number of project developers, obviously on this call, and sort of from their perspective, what's important in an offtake agreement is that you agree to a delivery timeline you're relatively comfortable on being able to deliver. There's always sort of, and then you need to have a grace period in that, you always need to look, these are basically the things you need to look for. Don't overpromise what you can deliver. Have an appropriate grace, negotiate an appropriate grace period if there are delays, because very often there are delays, and not necessarily because the project developer's fault, but sometimes because the registry takes longer, the verification process takes longer than anticipated. There may be, especially in nature-based, right? I mean, you can't really tell how quickly the tree is going to grow, right? It depends on all kinds of factors. You're going to be very clear as to payment obligations, right? When are the credits being transferred? So when does title transfer from you to the buyer? What are the payment terms? MRV is super important from a buyer's perspective. They want to be absolutely sure that monitoring, reporting, verification, that's properly done. And so as a supplier, this is something where you can come in and sort of build trust and integrity from the beginning. Choose the right standard for your project, because that follows the standard that you choose determines every step from there on down the road. You got to stick to that standard. You can be transparent about it to off-takers. Keep records, keep reports. That helps building integrity and trust.
Yeah, lots of key things. I mean, at the end of the day, markets run on confidence. Confidence should run on integrity. So without integrity, carbon credits are just numbers, not climate solutions. So what you've proposed is really critical. And I think the mindset we had, even, if I could look back 4 years when we were starting Grain, we saw standardization as the foundation from which innovation builds. So when we created basically our free tools and methodology assessments, is to create a structure so you can go faster, drive economies of scale, and help the registries, because the registries are bottlenecked. If everybody's submitting documentation, Peter, that looks different form factors, etc., well, credibility, you have time and capital are the two most valuable things anybody has. So you've got to ease that transition and make it more effective. So what you're highlighting there is hypercritical, and then you gotta go end to end, because you've got to be able to solve the situation around MRV. And that's one of the reasons, I mean, it's clear why biochar makes up the bulk of the market. And, at our investor conference during Climate Week, and we were very happy to have a lot of companies that were doing, had been doing direct air capture or CCUS or other things, and they were looking for biochar to fill those portfolios for requirements and commitments. That's exciting for this space, and it's something I think you and I have been talking about for a long time. And on the concept of time, I can tell you the thing that has taken the most time for a lot of our developers has come down to permitting and regulatory compliance. I was, during Climate Week, I got to be part of a session with Governor Gavin Newsom and other leaders, and we talked a lot about permitting and regulatory compliance. While I admire a lot of what California has done to try to accelerate things, permitting has not been a strong suit. And then you look at the Midwest and some of the other states where we're doing some work, we go a lot faster. In my home state of Rhode Island, we've been able to move the chains a lot more. And obviously, as you and I are both members of the U.S. Biochar Coalition, which has done some incredible work to advance the efforts and also make sure that biochar, pyrolysis is not recognized as incineration. In some cases, in some states tied to old titles that have been in there from the 70s. These are things that make it very, very hard and prohibit developers from doing these exciting projects. So if you could talk a bit more in detail from your world on the regulatory and legal side about what you're seeing with classifications and zoning considerations for these facilities, that's gonna do a lot of good for our developers, regardless of what state they're in.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, as far as a specific project is concerned, you need to look at the state regulations. You need to look what are the rules on the, county level, on the level of the relevant municipality. There we obviously have a bit of a patchwork across the nation and sort of different approaches to things. The general conceptually, how do you approach that is I would always recommend, and I think every project developer is doing that. You got to sort of in the inception phase of your project, you got to talk to the relevant authority early on, engage them in that process, tell them what you want to do, try to figure out what kind of permits you need. This depends also on the kind of feedstock that you have, right? Sort of, is it more like, does it fall into the category of biomass or waste disposal, depending on what you're doing. And then you have a very different kind of permitting process, whether you just need, I don't know, an air permit, a manufacturing permit. You mentioned that some might even, see pyrolysis as incineration, which causes all kinds of other questions or issues to run into. So, and it is a fairly, it is still sort of fairly a new technology in many ways that is evolving further, right? And it gets more efficient in the sense that you have pyrolysis machines that sort of try to optimize a particular kind of feedstock. Palm oil, for instance, right? Sort of who would have thought of that? But it's just like, so some are very specific with particular kind of feedstock. And it is important to engage the regulatory authority early on, build a good rapport with someone there, right? Tell them what you want to do. It helps. It goes a very long way if you are able to pick up the phone and get someone on the line and just ask a few questions. And they may be able to, to help you out, refer you to someone else at another department or at another authority, and smooth things over. So this is really, I would say, since permitting is something that's really sort of, in California, it's more, in New York, New York State, it's fairly centralized. In other states, you have to involve various kinds of agencies, which can be quite cumbersome and sometimes difficult to navigate. I think California is obviously doing a great job in advancing CDR in general, but it is a bit of a patchwork in terms of permitting. New York is less so, which makes it easier. But regardless, of in what state you're in, build a good rapport with someone helps you really, can be a tremendous help in the process.
And more importantly, have a lawyer that you don't have to teach everything to. I think that
Absolutely.
3 years working in this space is a lifetime, and that's very important, especially for developers that are looking to do projects and again have limited resources and capabilities. You want to work with somebody that really understands the pain points and understands that as you navigate air, water, solid waste permits, whatever that is, having somebody on your side that can already either point you in the right direction or understand how the different feedstocks and products can be classified to avoid stricter regulation is important. And I think, my experience sitting at a lot of these zoning board tables, more than I ever thought I'd be at, hinges on framing the facility, how you frame the facility. Is it advanced recycling? Is it a carbon negative manufacturing rather than disposal? And I think what's going to happen is regulators gain experience. Clear standards and early engagements are going to help, make it faster and more predictable to do this, but you got to have the right counsel asking the right questions in a timely fashion, because if you don't do that, and this will bleed into the next question, but it will impact the financing, the net present value, the cash flows, all these things, because without that, and there's a lot of OEMs on this call right now, they understand that pain point because they're waiting to get, company investors want to get money in the ground, OEMs want to ship product, but it all hinges on that element. And tied to that, Peter, is going to be the financing and the legal structures, because it goes hand in hand. So maybe for the groups here, understanding a bit more about, well, how should you think about structuring your business? How do you approach? Obviously, I've done a lot of interviews with debt and equity and structured credit investors about the space, but let's get a little bit more granular. And because what I want you to talk about more here is the structure tied to protections and also carbon credit delivery obligations. What are some floors you've seen, or collars, or other elements that investors and financiers might be asking for, where developers could be on the hook if they're not pertinent to that information and not on top of it?
Right. So it's important to set up the proper structure from the beginning, right? Sort of the right corporate structure, I mean, for your project. And this will largely depend on the size of it, right? If you, let's say for a relatively small project, it may be fine just to have one project company, right? If it's a bit bigger, you might want to split it up in maybe one project that operates the facility, another company that owns IP and certain development rights, just sort of to insulate certain assets related to the project, so that if something goes wrong on one end, the whole thing doesn't collapse. And that's something that a lender would want to see, right? They look at this also from a risk perspective. Obviously, every bank has an internal committee, and they say, well, how much money are we giving to these guys? What kind of assets do they have? Do they have any IP? Where is this situated? What is our recourse in the event of a default? So you got to structure it in a way with that kind of mindset right from the beginning, right? If you're looking for a lender to finance your project, it needs to be structured in an efficient and effective way so that you insulate potential risks to individual companies. Now, if you have sort of various projects, then at some point you would obviously need to have a holding company and then various SPVs underneath that. You could do that you could have a project company for every location where you run a project, for instance. That may very well make sense, um, particularly if they are in different states, because regulations will also change, and then you have new requirements potentially that you will have to fulfill on the ground, and you don't want that obligation to affect one project company that runs projects in California, New York, Florida, and South Dakota, when the only requirement that changes is in South Dakota, right? So you want sort of the other projects be not impacted by that. It all depends. I think the biggest decision, obviously, at the beginning is sort of how vast is this project, right? How many locations do we have? How many facilities? If you just have, one pyrolysis machine somewhere, you don't need to think about a lot of structuring. One project company is fine. But as things pan out, structure it in a way that it makes it easy for potential investors to see that you think about isolating risk. Structure it also in a way that makes it easy for potential investors to provide equity if that is something you want to do. That may start with the kind of holding company you're setting up, right? If you're looking for VC money, you want to use a Delaware corporation. You don't want to use an LLC because a VC investor won't invest in an LLC. So these are all things to consider. It's really important at the beginning, sort of, to see, what are we trying to do? Where do we see our project going? We want to expand. Do we want to get investors in? How are we going to finance that? And all these things will determine the structure.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of times, depending, first of all, you got to know what kind of capital. One of the things we try to do is understand how much money does a project actually need, what kind of capital can get you there. And many times you got one, as we all know, we've all raised money, you've got one shot on goal. So how do you put yourself in the best possible position to drive the confidence and show that these projects are gonna be successful? I'll tell you, a couple of projects that we've been part of commissioning recently and doing the DMRV, these contracts increasingly mirror energy sector PPAs, where you're assigning responsibility for operations, compliance, and credit issuance, and then you've got separate arbitration and mediation frameworks, such as those, like you look at Puro Earth, looking to go faster, lower cost dispute resolution pathways. The thematic is the tools will build confidence and accountability across the value chain. But can you, Peter, talk maybe a little bit more, just sticking on the risk management topic? Anything else you could, a topic that's came up a ton during Climate Week is insurance, indemnity. Obviously, look at states like Florida, states that are impacted by, certainly by climate resilience. They have different levels, maybe, of dispute resolution mechanisms tailored for carbon removal projects. We look at insurance tied to equipment, different sizes, TIR, et cetera. Can you talk a bit more about some of those risk management tools in the kit and maybe provide some recommendations there, at least high level, before the developer reaches out to you, some of the things they should be thinking about to drive that discussion?
Right. This is so the fact that insurance comes up more and more is also a sign that the market is increasingly maturing, right? So there are more sort of legal considerations around that, how we structure that. There are more discussions around financing, and the next thing is sort of insurance, and that's basically, those are the three key components of any mature market, right? You got the law, finance, insurance. And insurance is something that comes up more and more. So for a CDR, you obviously have sort of, product liability and equipment insurance. What is becoming sort of more and more talked about and to some extent also deployed is insurance around carbon credit deliveries. There are providers out there sort of increasingly that provide insurance coverage if carbon credits aren't delivered on time. They're mainly available for buyers, but they can be a huge facilitator for in an offtake scenario, especially for buyers that depend on credits at a certain time because they want to meet their communicated climate targets. They want to have some kind of recourse where they can tap into to get credits from an alternative source. I've also had one thing sort of that annoys me a little bit about this market is that sort of there is sort of a great sense of collegiality to some extent, right? And we all sort of CDR something, we're doing something good for the planet. And we all sort of in this together. But then I find very often that when it comes down to implementation, very often companies sort of just sort of fight for themselves and are very competitive. So what I've seen, a discussion I've seen coming up is that there could be a solution, a pool of carbon credits by suppliers, right? In the sense where it's sort of suppliers source credits, put it in a pool and say, hey, if you have a shortfall, here's a pool we all contributed in, where a buyer could tap into. This is something sort of that would be a little bit sort of innovative and new, but I think it could have the potential of advancing the market and find something, because insurance is obviously very important. It has its challenges. It's also securing the delivery of a carbon credit. One thing is just to pay monetary damages, okay, but that may not be the ultimate solution if the buyer wants a credit. But they're limited, right? Most of the credits that have been purchased to date, hardly any have been, not hardly any, but the vast majority still needs to be issued and generated and delivered. And we'll get to that stage at some point, and we're seeing that already, that there are shortfalls, that things take longer than anticipated, and that makes it also challenging for insurers active in this space. Where do they want to source credit from if there is already sort of a delivery shortage in the market? So it's becoming, it's becoming more and more part of the discussion, and I sort of welcome that and appreciate that. And I think it's very important for any market to mature, to have insurance, to have risks mitigated by insurance solutions. But there are sort of particular challenges to CDR that I haven't quite sort of gotten my head around yet, if that will pan out the way it's supposed to.
It is. There are elements where it's a bit of a waiting game right now. I can tell you, having met with a lot of these value chain companies, they're eager to go. They have a massive, they have OpEx related issues, and there's a clear need for the biochar. And to your point, Peter, they're waiting for the big player, pick the name of the company, to make a decision. Am I going to invest directly in this facility, or am I going to make a commitment to the carbon credits? And then said company, let's say it's a dairy, will be responsible for financing and entering it, doing all the legal work, the heavy lift, etc., to get the project going. But people want to do this stuff today, but a lot of it is this quagmire and minutia figuring out who's going to do what. And then, of course, the insurance plugs in. But I'm happy to hear you say that when you see this confluence of law, finance, and insurance entering the equation, it's a sign of maturation and that makes me think of like in the early days, it was more about promise. And now we're going towards our own level of permanence in the industry, which is intriguing, but I can't agree with you more. And it's one of the reasons I really enjoy the time we get to spend together because we talk about these innovative solutions and we have the ability with this network to actually drive it to reality because we're all here for the long run. And we've seen, I mean, I can't believe what we've seen just in the last 3-4 years alone. I'm blown away by it. And that will lead me kind of to the final question because we're starting to get a lot of questions and I want to start to address a few of them. But this is critical because obviously, I get to spend a lot of time with policymakers. I spent a lot of time during Climate Week with my home state senator, Sheldon Whitehouse, who's played a massive role in the Fix Our Forests Act, obviously in the CDR Leadership Act with Congressman Tonko here in New York. These are emerging trends that they heavily involve legislation, whether it's 336, which everybody on this call probably is familiar with, biochar reimbursement incentives, tax credits. How are these going to shape compliance obligation opportunities? Again, you're in such a unique spot to answer this question because not only are you're so in it from your practice, but you're also a member of the U.S. Biochar Coalition, which is on the Hill regularly. So talk about these trends emerging, what you're seeing, and what the individuals on this call should be looking for as they progress in their own journeys.
I think what's happening on a policy level is sort of incredibly important for this space, right? So on a federal level, we're not going to have a compliance market for the foreseeable future, if ever. But there are a number of initiatives and lobbying activities that could be tremendously helpful, particularly for biochar, right? For instance, let's talk about Section 45Q. And there is a bill, right? There's a bill on the Senate floor that biochar and other solutions would benefit from a 45Q tax credit. The IRS has issued certain guidance with respect to for those pathways that are already eligible for a tax credit. The IRS has issued obviously guidance and parameters as to what kind of requirements these installations need to fulfill. That is an incredibly important element for MRV, right? Sort of if the legislator or the IRS says these are the kind of requirements this installation needs to fulfill in order to get a tax credit, that has a huge impact on the voluntary carbon market, right? By saying, oh, okay, finally we have some government, some legislators, some authority telling us what are the MRV requirements for this kind of installation. Because until now in the VCM, it's all private institutions that develop these methodologies. And they're fine, but there's a lot of patchwork also, which leads to confusion. So I think that that's really something to look out for as to what are the requirements of a government to provide incentives to CDR, because that typically comes along with a set of parameters that the particular pathway needs to fulfill.
And it's interesting because I was glancing at my phone because I had taken notes in a USDA meeting recently about like per acreage. If you think about these different protocols, and you just brought up, 45Q for a while had been a question mark, but if you think about, per acre, how much in a return you could get by leveraging, 45Q, USDA preferred, REAP, reimbursement incentive, NRCS, and then you think about the costs of of fertilizer. You can model it against corn as an example. Corn today, per acre, probably, it would cost about $750 for biochar, give or take. But you start to layer in, if you got 700 per acre for 45Q, 60 for USDA preferred, 1,000 for REAP, 250 reimbursement for NRCS, credits, you're roughly looking at maybe $750 to $1,500. I mean, it gets, again, I'm being abstract here, but and you got to be pragmatic in how you approach it. But hearing you say those things is really encouraging. And I could tell you, I say this to everybody I talk to, the space is very bipartisan. I mean, these people I've known for a long time, you see them in violent agreement because just drive across the Corn Belt. Those rocks they're not channeling themselves upwards through the soil. That is erosion at 16 times faster rate than we can replenish. This is a real problem. We're pumping from aquifers at record rates across the Central Valley, and it's harming the soil. It's harming our ability to have water security. And farmers are in particular bearing the biggest brunt. They shouldn't just be getting, oh, here's a $13 billion handout, tied to missing something. It should be tied to what you and I talk about all the time in terms of actually regenerating that land for future generations. And, I think, Peter, your frameworks and visibility are going to play a key role to help make, this is why the USBC, I think, is so excited to have somebody that, like you, that is a lawyer, fighting on our behalf so we can advance these efforts. So
no, and I mean, you're exactly right. I think it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging that it is such a bipartisan, that you see so much bipartisan effort in this. You're exactly right pointing that out, and I find that very very encouraging, particularly sort of in the current landscape that can sometimes be seen as a bit divisive, to say the least.
it can be, and I say, look, we didn't have a magic wand or a bullet or what have you to pick. I mean, it's a bit of luck that you end up getting to space. It's a huge need, right? You have 50 billion plus market for waste and lots of other things. Now, we have a few minutes. What I'd like to do, I pulled a couple questions. I always commit to our community and listeners. And obviously, this is recorded. This will be recorded. You'll be able to share it with your colleagues. All the questions we do not get to, Peter and I will answer them and we'll send them across when we put the recap. So I promise you, your questions will get answered. But let's hit on at least, we should be able to get to at least two questions. First one, close to the vest for me, obviously because of my past work in the energy electricity space. The question to you, Peter, is, beyond the credits and the physical biochar products, how do you suggest working energy and electricity into contracts for projects that produce waste heat or biogas for potential sale?
Right. So I think the key element is obviously sort of energy supply, right, and sort of price volatility. So it depends on electricity. First of all, so where do you source it from, right? It should be renewable. Just to make this, to make CDR wholesome, obviously.
Of course.
You got to get sort of the right supply, and you got to make sure that the price is right, and that if you have, for instance, if you have an offtake agreement for carbon credits, it can get very tricky. But you could think about, well, if the electricity price increases, my production cost for the carbon credit increases. Maybe there should be some kind of a price adjustment clause that allows me to sell the carbon credit for more if the electricity price goes up. Right. So that's sort of one aspect where you could think about that, sort of a carbon credit producing installation is impacted by price of the electricity.
And I'll highlight one thing. We made an announcement this week of a partnership with a company. Although we do need more country partnerships than ever before to move the needle, with Electrotherm. And Electrotherm makes the ORC units that you can basically integrate to create renewable electricity, and that would qualify for investment tax credits, which is very very encouraging. So up to 30 to 50%.
Right.
once the project essentially goes live. So I think to qualify for ITC and REAP, you've got to prove that you can generate renewable electricity or heat that replaces fossil energy. And I think REAP covers, I'm pretty sure it covers up to 50% of the project cost. So you can use that as a takeout for your debt over time, which is really cool. So that's one element to keep an eye out for, and obviously, again, something we'll continue to post on and highlight and look for in projects. Another question that really stood out to me: is there a role, Peter, for innovative insurance products to help de-risk these agreements? So we talked a little bit at a high level about insurance, technology, performance insurance, and stuff like that. Where do you see any innovative examples, I guess, that would stand out to you in terms of helping to de-risk the agreements further?
Um, right. So I mean, there are a handful of insurance companies that focus on carbon credits, right? There is Orca, Kita. Um, they what they basically try to do is to provide in-kind insurance um, for in the event of a delivery shortfall or a generation shortfall. Um, they don't have, interestingly enough, they don't have these, so they don't have these credits on their books themselves, right? They need to source them as well on the market, which sort of gets it a bit tricky. And I haven't quite seen, honestly, I'm not entire. I think it gives sort of a buyer a sort of confidence, maybe for the internal approval process, in a sense of saying we do have insurance, and I think in that respect, it's very important. I haven't seen it tested in the market yet, so I don't know um, if there actually has been a claim. I'm not aware of it. There very well may have been, but I don't know if there actually has been a claim where a buyer went to one of these insurance companies and said, "You got to deliver me credits."
Mm.
I have to inquire. In my practice, it hasn't come up. I haven't heard of it.
Well, that's definitely one we'll do some digging and come back. I'm intrigued by
Right.
it. I hadn't heard of it myself either, but interested to know more. In the closeout, two final things. Peter, number one, how can folks get a hold of you, learn more, etc.? And then number two, November 6th, 2026, you and I are doing this webinar together again, which I'm sure we will be. Where do you envision the market?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic, Jason. I'm cautiously optimistic about the market. I think there will be a consolidation that we'll see next year. There will be, especially sort of on the more CapEx intense CDR solutions, right? DAC is going to take a huge, I think they're going to take a huge hit next year. That's sort of my prediction. But there will be some winners coming out at the end that will, carry the torch. So I am cautiously optimistic that we're heading in the right direction. As in any new market, there's nothing unusual about this, right? This is a fairly nascent industry, and there are ups and downs. And we are sort of in the really wonderful position, and that's what I like about this market so much, is that we are so early in the game, and that there are a lot of sort of innovative solutions out there, and there are a lot of things we are able to shape and to create precedent. And that's very exciting to be in this space. But there will be, obviously, there'll be also a valley to go through before you can climb up the mountain again on the other side for some of the companies. Put it that way.
Well, we're going to climb that mountain together. This is a community. I always say there's a reason We call our company Grain Ecosystem. Peter, honored to have you as a part of it. And I'll just close by saying we will get a follow-up email. This will go live. Your questions will be answered. And for many of you that have questions about offtakes, basically information, materials, etc., grainecosystem.com. Sign up for the free tool. It'll really help you orient yourself so that when you do go to Peter, you're able to have a really dynamic and thought-provoking discussion. Same when you come to myself and our team to make sure we're helping you to move faster and ask the right question. So Peter Meyer, again, thank you for joining us on I'm sure, a hectic Thursday, and I'm looking forward to keeping this dynamic dialogue going. Take care.
Jason, thank you so much.